Uh, we are live now. Good evening to you all. Welcome to the 12th session of the lecture series, What is Marxism? Introductory lecture. Uh, Today's topic is New Directions in Marxian Theory. So, without wasting any time, I will go straight away to our speaker, Professor Pranab Kanti Basu. Uh, Pranab, if you are ready, you can start. Pranab, you are muted. Please unmute yourself.
Okay. I don't know what's happening. Not showing. Yeah. Can you see it? Can you see it? Can you see the
Yes,
slide?
yes, yes, Pranab.
Okay. So
It has just gone.
yeah, it's gone.
Yeah,
You can see it now.
yeah, yeah.
Okay. Now, in our last two lectures, we were discussing the meaning of emancipation as it occurs in Marx. We had seen that there are various meanings that Marx attaches to emancipation. The highest of which is human emancipation. We had argued that human emancipation, in the sense elaborated by Marx, is an ever unreachable goal. Alienation will forever plague human society, but the goal of struggle is to strive for it. Now, we said that very briefly it is unreachable because human emancipation, we had seen that quotation from Marx. By it, he means that in fact there will be no difference between the subject and the object, and our sense perception will be the same as our mental conception. So that is, of course, something we know is not possible. So it's a goal to which we strive, but is never reachable. There will be always different kinds of emancipation which will be left to be done. There is also no segment of society that embodies the essence of human emancipation, neither the working class nor the vanguard party. This we had discussed in detail, that if there is no emancipation, total human emancipation, so there is no essence of human emancipation. It's all an overdetermined totality, and we have to strive for different kinds of emancipation. So there is no question of any segment of the society embodying the human essence, and therefore being destined to carry out the final revolution. But Marxism has been a clarion call of liberation because it alone focuses on emancipation from economic exploitation, which is the major source of human misery for the vast majority of people who live and die in poverty. So this is what distinguishes Marxism from other liberation philosophies or liberation theologies, that it focuses on economic exploitation, which is the major source of misery for the poorest of the poor, which is the vast majority of the people. We had also argued that Marxism will prevail in spite of failures and impasses because it is self-critical theory. Now, this we had seen that because in that was in the initial lectures we had discussed Marx's philosophy through our reading of the thesis on Feuerbach, and there we had seen that he questions both the mechanical materialism of Feuerbach and the idealism of Hegel, and he constructs practice as the bridge between the object world and the subject world, between matter and thought. So there is a continuous dialectic, and this therefore leads to self-criticality in theory. You can never, the conception is never complete. You conceive, you plan, you try to execute, whether it be in revolution or it be in simple production, productive activity. You see the limitations and you again change your plan. So it is a continuously there is an interaction. So this is where self-critical theory becomes self-critical. There is no defined that this is theoretical and this is empirical. Today we talk about some major developments in Marxist theory thinking as I see them. Of course, this is a bit of a personal journey because there are so many developments that one has to segment, one has to choose, and this is my choice. And thinking as I see them, of course, in the process, we will revisit some of the issues of emancipatory practice. After Marxist times, Marxism has evolved in tune with new developments in society and in the domain of ideas. So both on the material side, social development, and on the side of ideas, there have been vast changes. And these have influenced the growth of Marxism. Keeping it class focused, Marxism has itself evolved and absorbed some ideas. It has itself influenced some ideas. Our reading of Marxism, Marxian philosophy itself, challenges what was once the accepted view about Marxism. So what we have called the overdetermination perspective. This is what is also called the new Althusserian perspective. Now, this is of course something which challenges the reading of Marxism as a kind of destined as a theory which is truth and which promises a destined revolution which will lead to human emancipation. So our reading too is itself a new reading, and it challenges what was now still the orthodox view within most of the communist parties. New areas are being continuously brought into Marxist discourse. The reading that we have been presenting has also come in for some serious criticism, directly or associatively. That is, some ideas have been criticized which are embodied, which are within, which are also used within this overdetermination method. So associatively, the overdetermination method has been criticized. We will attempt a rather cursory glance at these developments. One area that is of great concern to theoreticians and activists is the question of agency. The definition of class in terms of surplus production, appropriation, distribution, and receipt may be too broad to define an affective unity and hence may need to be supplemented with concrete characteristics of class segments. Now, supplementation is an idea that we had discussed previously. You add to and you also change. This addition itself changes the original. So within the overdetermined approach, it is possible to do this, to add, because it is overdetermination as the methodology. It leads to an analysis which is never ending, just as social processes are never ending. So we just draw a line and write something. We just draw a line and say something. The definition of class in terms of production, appropriation, distribution, and receipt may be too broad to define an affective unity. That is, a unity, a segment of the population which thinks itself as united and can therefore organize themselves into movement, and hence may need to be supplemented with concrete characteristics of class segments, segments which feel an affinity with the members of which feel affinity with one another. Class is not the appropriate elementary agency for understanding all inequities that call for emancipation. So, for example, gender, ethnic and religious oppression, environmental degradation, etc. The question of subjectivity formation of individuals that make up collectives, including classes, is an area of concern. So this leads to concern with the consciousness of collectives. Psychology, sources of consciousness, conflicting interests of an individual and collectives, culture and its manipulations are some of the areas of new interests as these delve into the making of agents of change. Whether you call it, whether it is class or non-class, these are all associated with making up the subjectivity, the mind, the mentality of agents of change, and also the agents of status quo. So whether it be the oppressed classes which want to change, or the oppressive classes which want the status quo, all these psychology conflicting interests of individuals, which of course overdetermination recognizes thoroughly. Areas related to consciousness or subjectivity formation are nationalism and fascism, and these are of particular interest to understanding the emergence of ultra conservatism worldwide, including India. But we will not have time to go into this. But I hope that someday someone will discuss these questions. Perhaps we can extend our group, and perhaps someone will talk about these things. Related to the question of agency is the question of state power. A principal area of interest that has emerged since Lenin is the question of geopolitics. Lenin raised this in the context of imperialist wars. During his time, there was considerable debate around the concept of imperialism. Though Lenin was arguing in terms of class configuration, particularly monopoly capitalism, later supplements often took the nation as a unit and theories of development as underdevelopment. That is, some segments, some nations develop, leading to and being fueled by the underdevelopment of other part of the world. World systems, globalization, etc., all these emerged. It is also recognized that there are certain issues of great current concern that cannot be adequately addressed within the Marxian scheme. So there are. It is not that the class-based approach will be able to explain everything. Some of the above issues were hinted by Marx, but not adequately elaborated. Now, given this, we will try to discuss. We are just enumerating these. We will try to discuss these issues in a bit more detail. Now, in order to do that, the first that comes to mind is the concept of class. It is time we revisited the concept of class with the specific concern of subjectivity formation and mobilization in mind. We had used Resnick and Wolff's definition. Class positions of individuals within the capitalist economic system are formally defined by their belonging to particular groups related to each other through processes of production, appropriation, distribution, and receipt of surplus value. As we have stressed throughout, this definition conforms with Marxism's primary concern with undoing economic exploitation. Such an entry point is essential for understanding economic exploitation and undoing it. You see, we have used the word essential, but we are talking, we are saying we are Marxism is anti-essentialist. Now, what Resnick, Wolff, and the neo Althusserians do is, as we are also done throughout the lecture, it is the entry point into the discussion, into the analysis. Now, that doesn't mean that the class will define everything. Because of overdetermination, various kinds of relations, apart from class relations, they influence the class relation, and the class relation influences them. So it is an entry point. It is essential an entry point. Because why? It is essential because it is politically determined. Politically determined in what sense? Because of Marx's concern with economic exploitation. Though, as we have argued, the abstraction involved in defining value is not idealist, being a real abstraction, the surplus value orientation is nonetheless an abstraction and needs supplementation with concrete class segment affinities for political practice. A real abstraction, that is as opposed to the idealist abstraction, Hegelian type, it is called real. We are saying that it is real abstraction in senses which we had discussed in detail. Uh, in on one hand, we have Rubin's explanation that this value surplus value based this discourse of class, this idea, the concept of value, it is necessary because it determines the real social division of labor. This is Rubin's view, and we have also seen Maraglu and Callery's view that it is real abstraction in the sense that it is affects, it is internalized within an exchanged based economy. So this is a real abstraction as opposed to say the abstract utility, the concept of abstract utility, where it is based simply on the individual who is divorced from all social moorings. The surplus and surplus value orientation is nonetheless an abstraction and needs supplementation with concrete class segment affinities for political practice. Now we will discuss this in detail as we go along. That is, we have to segment the classes. Classes are determined formally by what we have defined: production, appropriation, distribution, receipt. But for political practice, they have perhaps to be segmented in finer with finer tuning. Now we will go into that. Within the overdetermined scheme, such supplementation is theoretically permissible. What is supplement? Is something that adds to but also modifies. And this is what overdetermination is all about. Because from the economic processes, we go to the political processes. The political processes again react back on the economic processes and so on. So we are constantly adding, and that is mutating the original. For example, emancipation, we talk of emancipation, then we talk of political emancipation. The original idea of emancipation itself is modified. Then we talk of economic emancipation, we talk of gender emancipation, whatever. Now, similarly, equality, we had discussed this, that equality means different things to different people. So you say equality, bourgeois equality. Now, when you say bourgeois equality, adds to, but also it changes the meaning of equality. A working class equality, we had seen this precisely, that there's a difference between how the working class conceives equality and how the bourgeoisie conceives equality. So you supplement, you add to, but you also change the original. Now, we need to supplement our real abstraction of class. It is unfortunate that the last chapter of volume 3 of Capital, classes, remain unfinished. Now, this is something which is, of course, this is my debt to Pradeep Banerjee, a researcher who was doing seminal work on value theory, as I perceive it, but tragically passed away before submission of his thesis, has pointed out, and this is an unpublished work, of course, has pointed out some major unsolved issues in the surplus value oriented definition. It relies, we are just talking about one, it relies entirely on the value side, which is abstract according to Marx, as he himself says in volume 1, chapter 1, ignoring the use value of commodity, which is concrete, and that is also mentioned in chapter 1. The former is the viewpoint of capital, and the latter is the viewpoint of labor. Marx notes in Grundrisse, page 196. If his philosophy related the concrete or material and abstract or thought aspects through practice, why should his class theory be otherwise? This is a question that Banerjee raised. Recall a statement we had made in use value, drop out completely. Again, from Grundrisse, in the relation of capital and labor, exchange value and use value are brought into relation. The one side, capital, initially stands opposite the other side as exchange value, and the other side, labor, stands opposite capital as use value. The laborer is selling labor power, which is part which he was enjoying as long as it was part of the life process, is enjoying its use value. So the laborer and the capitalist, they stand opposed to one another, labor representing the use value and capitalist representing the exchange value. As we commented, class defined from the point of view of surplus value is suitable for construction of the analytic of capital, as one side, capital, initially stands opposite the other side, labor, as exchange value. Exchange value leads to value and therefore to surplus value, which represents the position of capital, while use value represents the position of labor. This seems to indicate that Marx was uncomfortable with the complete elimination of concreteness or use value from the theory of commodity. This is part of a longish, inconclusive note in Grundrisse relating use value and exchange value. It also indicates that the value, hence surplus value analytic, represents the position of capital, while the use value position represents the position of labor. Now, again, this is from Capital Volume 1, the last chapter. The first question to be answered is this: what constitutes a class? At first glance, the identity of revenues and the sources of revenue. There are three great social groups whose members, the individuals forming them, live on wages, profit, and ground rent, respectively, on the realization of their labor power, their capital, and their landed property. However, from this standpoint, physicians and officials, for example, would also constitute two classes, for they belong to two distinct social groups. The members of each of these groups receiving the revenue from one and the same source. The same would also be true of the infinite fragmentation of interest and rank, into which the division of social labor splits laborers as well as capitalists and landlords. The latter, for example, into owners of vineyards, farm owners, owners of forests, mine owners, and owners of fisheries. That is, he's talking about the landlords. So you take the interest if you take interest, then if you take the commonality of interest, then he says that these three large groups are insufficient. You have to break them up into smaller groups. You could infer, Banerjee suggests, that the surplus value position defines three great social classes, while the use value position fragments them into smaller units. The division of social labor refers to the distribution of society's total labor in different activities, producing commodities with different use value. So, the same would also be true, the previous quotation, the same would also be true, the same would also be true of the infinite fragmentation of interest and rank, into which the division of social labor splits laborers as well as capitalists and landlords. So there's a fragment division of social labor that is according to utility. You're producing different goods. This causes fragmentation of interests. The question of interests introduces the idea of lived experiences. This opens the door to a position propounded by E.P. Thompson that class is not a structural phenomenon. Like we have argued, we have argued that it is a structural phenomenon. So he argues against this, that it is not a structural phenomenon; it is a historical phenomenon. We do not subscribe, but argue that Thompson's position is a valid supplement to the value definition. At the very beginning of the making of the English working class, E.P. Thompson argues, and I quote, by class, I understand an historical phenomenon unifying a number of disparate and seemingly unconnected events, both in the raw material of experience and in consciousness. By class, I understand a historical phenomenon unifying disparate and seemingly unconnected events, both in the raw material of experience and in consciousness. I emphasize that it is a historical phenomenon. I do not see class as a structure or even as a category, but as something which in fact happens and can be shown to have happened in human relationships. So he is saying that it is from a large number of dispersed events, both in time and space, that a group feels a unity and uh, commonality in human relationships, and this is what makes the class happen in history. A little later, he elaborates class happens when some men, as a result of common experiences, inherited or shared, feel and articulate the identity of the interests as between themselves and as against other men whose interests are different from and usually opposed to theirs. So it is a question of identity of interest within a group, a felt identity, and also an opposition to another group who which group also feels an affinity amongst themselves. So this is what he thinks defines a class. Though immediately afterwards he said the class experience is largely determined by the productive relations into which men are born or enter involuntarily. Class consciousness is the way. So, in a sense, he is again reverting. This is probably a hangover because he is defining class not in the way in which we think of class. He's defining it purely in an historical sense. What we are saying is that experience, affinity, and opposition, all these have to be taken as supplements for defining class as in practice, in political practice, for defining identities of groups in political practice. What he's saying, on the other hand, is that no, this itself defines. It happens in history. This is not something to which we subscribe. Though immediately afterwards he says, because he is definitely a Marxist, the class experience is largely determined by the productive relations in which men are born or enter involuntarily. Class consciousness is the way in which these experiences are handled in cultural terms. So it is again, now it becomes a base superstructure thing which he tries to not to bring in. Class consciousness in a way in which these experiences are handled in culture terms. So it is the base. Here he's saying that it is a base class experience, productive relations, which is determining class experiences, and this is creating class consciousness, which is a product of culture. The class he refers to cannot obviously refer to a disparate members of working class as disparate members of working class as a migrant construction worker and a salaried public sector enterprise worker, because they can hardly have any shared cultural experience. The problem is further heightened during the current post-Fordist regime, where regular employees are replaced by so-called sub-producers or service partners who may work from their homes or as gig workers respectively. So we have various kinds, segments of working people coming up, and this is something which we have to deal with caution and develop our theoretical approaches to it. It is not simply sufficient to say that anyone who produces a surplus for others. Now, all these things, whether you're working from home, you consider yourself as a owner producer, even though your surplus is being exploited, all these things have to be taken. And the gig workers, who of course know that they are workers, but who are passed off as service partners. This takes us back to a controversy to which we are already referred: class in itself versus class for itself. In the present context, we can say that we have three different concepts of class in Marxist texts. That is, as we have seen it. One, the structural definition or analytic definition of class that occurs in Capital Volume 1 and 2, and with which the surplus production, appropriation, distribution, and receipt definition that we have used throughout coincides. Secondly, we have the class components that are antagonistic towards their particular exploiters. Class against capital, for example, which we'll see presently, that has been called class in itself by some. And thirdly, we have class that is unified as class against class, also referred to as class for itself. Both the second and the third, that is class in itself and class for itself, definition are consonant with E.P. Thompson's approach that claims that class is always a lived experience. What is the difference then between class in itself and class for itself? That in the lived experience, class in itself feels antagonistic to particular capitalists, say, whereas class for itself, it has imbibed, uh, um, it has absorbed the idea that it is in opposition to the entire work capitalist class. Both the second and the third definition are consonant with E.P. Thompson's approach that claims that class is always a lived experience. This would also tally with the conception of class that Marx expounds in the last chapter of Capital as interpreted by Banerjee. The question of use values as opposed to surplus value, production, appropriation, distribution, and receipt become important in this context. Those engaged in the production of similar use values have, as proposed by Marx, the same interests. the gig worker would have some different kinds of interest. The construction worker would have some kind of interest. The PSC workers would have different kinds of interest. This would be consonant with E.P. Thompson's definition. The question of interest. Now we are. It's not that we are concluding. I'm just saying that these are the ways in which the controversies are developed, and I'm just putting it there and not ending the discussion. I am not an authority to end the discussion. The question of interest, that is what the lived experience, creating interests, which should be the hallmark of class. This question of interest leads to a vast field explored cursorily and in fragments by Marx, the field of culture and subjectivity or consciousness formation. Forms of domination to which Marx was not alive, being like everyone a prisoner of his times, have since gained visibility. New fields of emancipation have opened up, old repressions have resurfaced with greater ferocity. So, when we talk of interests, we have to talk of culture, how consciousness is formed, what impinge on our consciousness, and then a vast lot of things which are newly opened up in discourse, which are engaging us. These all lead to different fields of emancipation which are not discussed by Marx. Religion, gender. Religion, of course, was something which is discussed by Marx, but it has resurfaced again, and in a way which is very intimately related with the emergence of, I would say, crony capitalism. I do not have time to go into that, but in our country, of course, it is intimately related with that. So this is a re-emergence of religion. This is not the old political state based on religion, which has to be which have to, an emancipated state is now digressing into a religious state, and it requires a different kind of analysis. That is what I feel. Then there is the question of gender, which was not as important when Marx was writing. Question of patriarchy, identity politics, environment. These have been explored in great detail by many Marxists. Recall that the objective of social change, according to Marx, is to achieve human emancipation. That is the ultimate objective. Given the nature of social movements during his time, Marx thought human emancipation involved abolition of private property. He took it step by step, as we have discussed. Political emancipation, that is, emancipating the state, which is based on politics, emancipating the state from its role in uh, mm, dividing society, from its role, from its exclusivist role, that is, emancipating state from religion. The only principle of religion that Marx talks of thoroughly, discusses thoroughly, is religion. That is, some people, because they have right to, because they have belong to a certain religion, are excluded from the right to elect their representatives. And of course, there is also, he also talks of exclusion on the basis of property, that is, where franchise was restricted. And we saw this in context of Thompson's Making of the Working Class and the conflict within the Cromwellian army, that exclusion of people from the right to elect their representatives because they were propertyless or they had less property. So they, all exclusions from the right to decide, the rulers right to decide, elect their representatives, this is to be first done away with. This is political emancipation. And when political emancipation has been achieved, Marx says that it is apparently the mystique of liberalism is this, that it says that, well, now there is equality, liberty, equality, and fraternity. But in reality, what has happened is that the inequities within the political system have been displaced to civil society, where just by dint of some people possessing productive property and some people not possessing private productive property, there will be exploitation. So the division, the alienation which was there in political society has now been displaced onto the civil society, and it is now based on the ownership of productive property. So once one is emancipated from this, there will be no longer any issues about left about to human emancipation. But we are now aware that there are other issues which also impede human emancipation, and this also leads to the question of linking the various anti-capitalist and non-class movement through some chain of equivalence. We'll talk about this. There are some significant Marxist contributions regarding such linkage based on the concept of hegemony. We discussed this through the pioneering work of Ernesto Laclau. Laclau builds his theory on the basis of Gramsci's concept of hegemony. We will first discuss this and go on to Laclau. The idea of cultural domination, which is the core of the principle of hegemony, was mooted by Marx in German ideology. We had mentioned this also. Gramsci's hegemony elaborates this. So, cultural domination is not something which was post Marx, which was posed by Gramsci, but it is there in Marx himself. This is from German ideology. The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, the class which is ruling the material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class, sorry, just a second. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal consequently also controls the means of mental production, so that the ideas of those who lacks the means of mental production are on the whole subject to it. This is of course a very mechanical way of putting it, but the idea, the conception is all right, that the ruling class must also be able to control our thought processes. It must be able to control the discourse. It must be able to generate what is true and what is false. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expressions of the dominant material relations. And this last sentence again is problematic, whether the ruling ideas are just the expression. Expression is a very inappropriate word, I think. But the idea is that posed in German ideology is that the ruling class does not simply rule by force, by coercion. It rules through its control over the ideas, through culture control. Now, this is from Gramsci. What we can do for the moment is to fix two superstructural levels. The one that can be called civil society, that is the ensemble of organisms commonly called private, and that of political society or the state. These two levels correspond, on the one hand, to the functioning of hegemony, which is the dominant group through which the dominant group exercises throughout society, and on the other, to that of direct domination or command exercised through state and the juridical government. So, of course, the terms political society has been interpreted in quite a different way in Partho Chatterjee, with whose writings a lot of us are familiar. But this is what Gramsci interprets civil society, difference between civil society and political society. Civil society comprises those ideas, those institutions which control our thought process, through which we are persuaded that this is the best society. And political society is the coercive apparatus of the state, the judiciary, the police, the military, the prisons, etc. This is the political society or the state, and civil society is the ideas plus the institutions. The institutions would be, for example, the schools and colleges, and also importantly, as later on Foucault was to discuss, hospitals, etc. The institutions through which our thoughts are controlled and the kinds of discourses, like say in economics, we talk of we talk of liberalism. Now, liberalism, as if there is a connotation of liberation. Now, this is something which creates a certain truth value, gives a truth value to what happens, what the market, so-called market determines. You see, we have been, for example, even in this Kolkata, there was a time when if the tram fare was raised by 1 paise, there would be a vast explosion of opposition. And but now, when fares are raised, when prices are raised, we take it as something which about which nothing can be done because the market has decided it. So this is part of the discourse to which we have been conditioned. This will be part of the civil society, and also where we are taught discipline, our families, our schools, our religious mosques and churches. All these will be part of the um, persuasive apparatus, which is part of civil society. The dominant class therefore rules through both coercion and persuasion, one working through the political society and the other working through civil society. Coercion is exercised through political society and persuasion, which constructs hegemony through civil society. Althusser named the sum of apparatus of persuasion, ideological state apparatus. This is the reference on the reproduction of capitalism, ideology and ideological state apparatus. Uh, can can we conceptualize the process of hegemony? Now, it is one thing to mention, to list, to construct a taxonomy, of the constituents of civil society, what leads to hegemony, but can we theoretically conceptualize hegemony? Now, this, I think I personally feel that Laclau gives the best theoretical perspective on hegemony. This relation by which a particular content becomes a signifier of the absent communitarian fullness is exactly what we call a hegemonic relationship. The presence of empty signifiers, in the sense we have defined them, is the very condition of hegemony. Now, I'm elaborating it. Laclau is referring to absent communitarian fullness in the context of the absence of embeddedness of human essence in the working class. So what Laclau is addressing the problem that, unlike what used to be thought, there is, first of all, there is no question of human essence. And if there was a question of human essence, it is not embedded in any segment of the society. So there is no, it is not as if somebody, some group embodies, it lives the fullness, a communitarian fullness, that is a non-alienated life. And so it can lead the emancipation. The absence of human essence is what Laclau calls the absent communitarian fullness. No group or class can represent the entire society or community as the universal. That is, there is no class or group whose interest is universal or all inclusive, like an essentialist reading of Marx posits the interests of the working class under capitalism to be. Laclau argues along general philosophical lines. We have shown that Marx's philosophical position can also be read out of the thesis on Feuerbach as anti-essentialist. We have seen this, I'm not repeating again, we have done this a lot of times. So if it is anti-essentialist, this rules out human essence. It rules out any kind of essence. If a community is fully defined and closed, there is no need or possibility of political practice that constructs a purpose of unity, say a struggle against the ruling hegemony. So if there is a human essence, and if there is a communitarian fullness which is embedded in a segment of the society, and then there's no need of political practice. They will inevitably lead to the full human, to the full human emancipation. The unity of front has to anchor itself. If it is because of the absence of humanitarian fullness, of communitarian fullness, that any class which aspires to overthrow the ruling class has to construct a unity of front. And this unity of front has to anchor itself in an empty or floating signifier, a signifier that is not attached to a fully present or known signified. That is, you have for example, during the freedom struggle, Gandhi could unify the people precisely because he meant different things to different people. Uh, this has been thoroughly discussed in various places, particularly by Partho Chatterjee in The Politics of the Governed. He talks of Shatinath Bhaduri's Dhurai Charit Manas, that in the village, people were praying to Gandhi Baba, which was constructed almost like we construct the scarecrows, and people used to pray to it. And then their mark of liberation, which Gandhi bestowed on them, was that the lower castes also took on the holy thread. Now, and people, there are we can't elaborate a lot of this, but there were some who went and saw Gandhi were so dissatisfied when they saw that Gandhi was wearing spectacles, because he was something like a god to them. No? So Gandhi meant different things to different people, and precisely because of this, he could act as a unifying totality, as a what is generally called a floating signifier, which to which various meanings can attach, which Laclau calls an empty signifier, that it is not attached to any particular signified. A signifier which does not constitute a fully formed sign. It doesn't attach itself to any particular signified. Just as the totality of classes lacks an absolute universal representation or binding principle, for example, human essence, individuals too lack a single unifying principle. Each individual is torn between conflicting pulls and pressures. So, this question of hegemony is not just the question of constituting a front which can overthrow the existing ruling dispensation. But it is also a question of constituting our own subjectivity, because we are pulled and pushed in various directions. So we have to have some unifying principle, without which there would be psychological disturbance. Just as the totality of classes lacks an absolute universal representation or binding principle, for example, human essence, individuals too lack a single unifying principle. Each individual is torn between conflicting pulls and pressures. Individuals must evolve some subjectivity organizing principle to avoid psychological trauma. That is, there must be some among all positions an individual inhabits that is capable of encompassing most, if not all, of the other positions. It is possible, of course, that some positions may be repressed. For example, someone who is familiarly defined as an office going housewife may actually occupy many positions with different interests, like wife, mother, daughter, feminist, etc. Out of these, the person may choose the feminist position as hegemonic position. This is a question. It's a question of choice. It's a politics. It is the overall hegemony is all about politics. Out of these, the person may choose the feminist position as the hegemonic position. As a mother, she may try to inculcate anti-patriarchal views in her children. As a wife, she may argue for greater equality in division of labor at home. In the office, she may fight against harassment of women, etc. The choice of feminism as the hegemonic signifier is, of course, determined by social and historical circumstances and is not thoroughly personal. So, though we talk of politics as choice, it is not as if we can I can choose to take I could have chosen to take a fundamentalist hindutvadi stance, because that is the way I grew up, the history, the friends I had, the milieu in which we were brought up. So all these, so it is not, when we talk of choice, it is not something which is a personal, which is an individual, like the utility maximizing individual chooses in the market, as the new classicals say. All possible positions that the person may take are not potentially hegemonic. For example, the position of wife cannot be hegemonic. It is not possible to be a wifely worker, a wifely mother, or a wifely feminist. Only those positions that can be represented as what are technically called floating signifiers, or as Laclau terms them, empty signifiers. That is, they are not wholly constituted. We do not know the exact meaning. This would be roughly what is meant by floating signifiers. All positions that can be represented as what are called floating signifiers are potentially hegemonic. I would put it this way: those positions that have the potential to act as qualifiers of other positions can be hegemonic. It is possible to be a feminist wife, but not a wifely feminist, for instance. A feminist wife, as we have just talked, she would talk of a more equal distribution of social division of labor within the household. The wifely position is too precisely determined to be able to qualify other positions. It is a closed identity that cannot be inclusive. So we start with the individual, we see how hegemony works with the individual, then move on to the social space. Let us move back from the discussion of individuals, psychic organization, and cohesion to the discussion of societal cohesion and the challenge to such cohesion. The ruling class exercises its thought control over all other class or group interests through the process of hegemony as proposed by Gramsci, which is elaborated through the working of the ideological state apparatus, as Althusser puts it. As we have discussed in the context of hegemonic organization of individual psyche, hegemonic organization of social order can only be achieved through the use of floating signifiers by the ruling classes, to which various groups attach their interest based aspirations and are, as a result, persuaded to believe that the ruling order is functioning for the general good. So, the ruling order must use certain empty signifiers or floating signifiers, not precisely defined value loaded terms, to maintain, to create the truth effect, to believe that this society is the best. For example, free market is one such hegemonic signifier. As discussed by many social scientists, prominently Foucault, there is very little that is free about the market. Apart from everything else, the state is constantly using its legislative and coercive machinery to convert what was in the common domain to the private domain, that is for the towards commoditizing that which is not commodity, for example, nature, knowledge, etc. So there is nothing free really about the market. But many are convinced that expanding this freedom would be in their best interests. Some think that the commodities they buy would get cheaper. Some think that this would excite growth and increase their job prospects. Some think this would open new entrepreneurial prospects for them as the economy is freed from bureaucratic nepotism and corruption. So, free market is an empty or floating signifier. Now, this incidentally was what Achedin was the promise with which Hindu fundamentalism came to rule in India. There are, of course, social spaces and positions that are not impacted by these hegemonic constructions. These are partially secured to the ruling order through discriminatory privileges as detailed by Chatterjee. So, not all can be persuaded. See, I can be persuaded, you, all of you who are listening can be persuaded, because we belong we interact within a society which is amenable to interpreting these empty signifiers in their own way. But there are parts of the society which cannot be persuaded through these floating signifiers. For example, this is an example which I'm taking from a book on globalization. For example, when the tribals were protesting the construction of the Narmada the Sardar Sarovar Dam. The initial position was that we would not allow the dam to be constructed. Koi nahi hatega, maad nahi banega. Uh, Now, from that position, gradually there was this Jal Samadhi prospect, and the temple, Supaneshwari temple was submerged. And then, so initially, they were the outsiders, they were not willing to negotiate with the modern society. They were being told, the cost benefit analysis was being made, and they were being promised this and that, but they were not willing to enter into this because it was a totally different world into which the discursive constructs of the ruling order did not could not pervade. So these tribals, they cloistered themselves and believed what they were fighting for, their way of life and livelihood, not concerned with any compensation. But once when this became a fait accompli, they came to the negotiating table, the Narmada Bachao Andolan, talking about compensation. So this now then, you are no longer outside, you are being co-opted into the society, and after whether they were given compensation, that's a different issue. But as long as you don't belong, you are not entering into the discourse of the ruling order, then you cannot be persuaded, so you have to be repressed. And this is exactly what was done. The tribals opposing mining interests, the tribals opposing dams, for example, they have to be coerced, they have to be beaten up. So not everyone can be accommodated within the hegemonic construction of the ruling order. A broader floating signifier, broader than the market, is liberalism, which comes today in the guise of neoliberalism. We discussed Marx's critique of the myth of liberal utopia. Political emancipation, the basis of liberalism, does not emancipate humanity but merely displaces the oppression from the arena of the state to the arena of civil society. Then surplus values appropriated in the form of profit simply by dint of ownership of private productive property. Now, the bourgeois revolution could not have succeeded if the bourgeoisie alone had revolted against the feudal lords. They mobilized the peasants and artisans who resented the many bondages and indignities they suffered at the hands of the rural lords. They also attracted the paupers and vagabonds with the slogans of liberty, equality, and fraternity. So these all liberty, equality, fraternity, these are all floating signifiers. These are empty signifiers that Laclau would put it. It can be interpreted in different ways by different groups, by different people. And this is exactly why this call could mobilize a large mass of people against the feudal, the landed aristocracy. And that is what led to the success of the bourgeois revolution. Each of these terms are floating signifiers. There is no fixed meaning that everyone attributes to them. When the bourgeoisie had seized power, they moved quickly to fix the meanings that suited them. Liberty or freedom was interpreted to mean just freedom from feudal shackles. The freedom of movement of the paupers, for example, was curbed by the poor laws that forced them into sweatshops in their respective parishes. Freedom did not mean freedom of movement. It just meant that you were no longer, the feudal hierarchy was abolished. For example, those who didn't have anything, they used to move about as vagabonds begging. And now their movement was curbed by law. They could be punished. They had to remain within the parish in which they were born, and then they would be forced into the sweatshops of their respective parishes, which were then leased out to the capitalists. They were given a pittance not even sufficient to keep mind and body together. Equality was the non-discriminatory laws. So that was all the equality was. The laws would not discriminate, uh, and ultimately, of course, politics would not either discriminate. You had adult suffrage, which was, of course, much later. Obviously, this was not the liberty and equality that the rebellious crowds had fought for. Now, I will just finish this slide and end for today. Now, So that the fact that there was this conflict, these were empty signifiers, and there could be different interpretations. This is well portrayed in E.P. Thompson, The Making of the English Working Class. He has documented a striking conflict that was caused by differing interpretations of equality. After the victory of the parliamentary forces over the British monarchy, the leveller Colonel Rainborough, leveller was a group of people who believed in leveling down everybody at the same level. It was a kind of conception of limited conception of socialism. The leveller Colonel Rainborough demanded unrestricted right to vote for every citizen. To this, Cromwell's son-in-law, General Ireton, responded, and I quote, "No person hath a right to an interest or share in disposing of the affairs of the kingdom that hath not a permanent fixed interest in this kingdom." You see, in plain terms, what was he saying? If you don't own a piece of the territory of England, you can't have the good of the nation at heart, so you don't get to vote. So if you don't own land, you don't have the interest of the country in your at heart, you might intelligence, you might say that Pakistan is good, you may say that BBC is better, etc. So you should not be given the right to vote. So you see, so there was this conflict. General Ireton was interpreting equality in one way, and Colonel Rainborough was interpreting equality in another way. So equality is an empty signifier. Just as the ruling classes construct a hegemonic position through the working of ideological state apparatus, the ruling order can be destabilized through the construction of a counter hegemonic mobilization. As we have seen from the example of the bourgeois revolution, this too is achieved through the deployment of floating signifiers. In this particular case, they were liberty, equality, and fraternity. It is also possible to conceive a rebellion against the bourgeoisie using the same slogans. For the working class to be able to destabilize the ruling order, it must be able to mobilize various segments to the construction of a chain of equivalence through a hegemonic process. Chain, that is, you demand gender equality. You demand that forests should not be cut down. All these movements, social movements, there has to be some empty signifiers which can string together. It can act as a string which binds together all these social movements. The hegemonic principle will emerge through the course of struggle. It is necessary even to unite disparate segments of the working class with widely differing interests. I'll end here today and take any questions if there are.
Uh,
I
I'm
think
expecting a lot of questions today, but I don't know if anyone has any question. Please feel free to ask the speaker.
Sir, I have a question.
it's still showing, no? The
Yes,
slide
yes,
is still
yes,
showing.
yes, yes, yes.
How do I get out of
Sir,
this?
sir,
Just
I
a second.
want to know, I want to know whether any surplus value is created in any government run activity like 100 days of work in India.
Well, government activity, state activity, of course, does create surplus value. Whether it does in the case of 100 days work, you see, public sector enterprises, for example, or the state-run railways, for example. Of course, they do surplus value, and the state then takes the position of the capitalist. So it's state capital. As regards whether 100 days work creates a surplus value for the state, I don't think so, because you see, the output that is produced by those employed under this scheme, that is not sold in the market. So that is a precondition for the generation of surplus value. Acha, just a second. So can you tell me, how do I stop sharing? Where is the stop sharing? I'm not showing. These three buttons, will they give the full screen? Okay. Anyway, please go on.
Thank you, sir.
Can I have two questions? One is that when we are talking about the agency, the we are actually agency and subjectivity when we're bringing in. Actually, we are bringing in the aspect of meaning, and the meaning is aspect of meaning, right? Subjectivity is basically the meaning of the agencies for their motivation of the work. So if we allow meaning to come in, is it not that we are coming out from that idea that individual who are actually playing the role of a
What are you using? Meaning. Meaning. You're talking of meaning.
uh,
What?
meaning of actions, meaning of motivations.
Building.
When you talk,
Building.
yes, meaning is
MEA. MEA.
MEANING,
Meaning of. Meaning of. What exactly?
actions.
Actions.
When individuals are initiating action, agencies are actually initiating actions for any kind of decisions. They have a meaning implied in that, which is varying from agency to agency.
By meaning,
It
are you implying objective?
No, not objective. I'm talking about that. Actually, the we use subjectivity under interactionism, and interactionism, when they talk about that, they are basically talking about that the individuals cannot be generalized because they have a subjective dimensions, and that is they are varying according to their meaning they have for their actions.
True.
Okay, so basically, I'm talking about that objectivity and subjectivity as two opposing stand. And when you're talking about that from, when individual workers are actually conditioned by their objective reality and they are actually developing a consciousness because of their objective reality, that is somehow actually giving them a class positions and also a kind of common sense of consciousness, which is leading to the true consciousness. True is basically something which is close to the essentialism, bringing essentialism into this thing. So if we are allowing that meaning to come in, individual subjective perception, then can we think of that consciousness model that when from false to true valid?
No, I've never used the word true. Throughout the conception of Marxism that I'm using, it is not. At the very beginning I stated that in Marxism, we do not believe in Marxism because it is true. It is a political choice. So there's no question of truth here.
No,
Uh,
I'm talking about the true consciousness. False and true consciousness, that market we have used.
we are not talking of the difference between false and true consciousness. That difference also we are not bringing in because every consciousness is a consciousness. That is what we are concerned with. Like religious consciousness, it's not a question of being a false consciousness. It is a kind of consciousness. Once you're conscious of it, once it is impinging on your subjectivity, there is no, if you are not, if there is nothing called truth, so you don't have true consciousness, and if you don't have a true consciousness, there cannot be a false consciousness either.
So true it
So
is, but acceptable. But what is false for a class for itself, from class in itself? We're talking about the
I
class
have
in it.
given my interpretation of it in detail in the last lecture. I don't.
Oh, actually, last lecture I
Oh,
missed
sorry.
it. Actually, I
I
should have.
Pradeep.
Oh,
I
okay, I shot the video. Okay,
yeah.
okay.
Pradeep. Pradeep.
হ্যাঁ,
Okay.
আচ্ছা প্রণবদা, আমি বাংলায় বলতে পারি?
হ্যাঁ, অবশ্যই। আচ্ছা, অবশ্যই মানে এই I think there's only one person না সাই রাজা, you'll be able to understand না? হ্যাঁ, চলো।
বলছি যে এই আমি কিছুদিন হলো এই লাকলাও গ্রুপে নিয়ে একটু পড়াশোনা করছিলাম, তো একটা জায়গা আমার খুব খটকা আছে, সেটা হচ্ছে যে ধরুন এই যে নিওলিবারাল হেজিমনি, তার বিরুদ্ধে একটা চেইন অফ ইকুইভ্যালেন্স দিয়ে বলা হচ্ছে যে ক্লাস, কাস্ট, এই রিলিজিয়াস মাইনরিটি, এরকম বিভিন্ন সেগমেন্ট অফ পিপল, সোসাইটি, তাদের একটা চেইন অফ ইকুইভ্যালেন্স দিয়ে একটা কাউন্টার হেজিমনি গড়ে তোলার প্রজেক্টে সেই এজেন্ডায় যুক্ত করা যাবে। এখন এখানে ধরুন এই যে মানে প্রলেতারিয়েট, অর্গানাইজড ওয়ার্কিং ক্লাস, সে নিওলিবারাল হেজিমনির বিরুদ্ধে তাকে আমি মোবিলাইজ করতে পারছি। কিন্তু যেখানে এই যে ভীমা কোরেগাঁও, এই যে দলিত কমিউনিটিটা ছিল মাহার, হ্যাঁ, আম্বেদকর যেখানে গেছিলেন, এটা একটা সময় ব্রিটিশ আর্মিতে এই মাহাররা ছিলেন সৈন্য হিসেবে, এবং ব্রাহ্মণ পেশওয়াদের এগেনস্টে তারা যুদ্ধে জয়ী হয়েছিলেন on behalf of the British, and they even now they celebrate this victory against the
প্রদীপ, আমার একজন মানে একদম ঘনিষ্ঠ বন্ধু, সে খুব ডিপ মানে সিভিয়ার ক্যান্সারে আজকে এই ডায়াগনোসিস। একটা ফোন আসছে, আমি নিয়ে তোমায় রেসপন্ড করছি। হ্যাঁ
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ, ঠিক আছে ঠিক আছে।
হ্যাঁ বল। হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ
হাতটা নামিয়ে দাও,
হ্যাঁ,
এই হাতটা রেজ করা আছে ওটাকে নামিয়ে দাও, মানে রেজ হ্যান্ডের আবার ক্লিক করো, ওটা চলে যাবে, স্ক্রিনটা ব্লক হয়ে যাচ্ছে।
প্রণবদা আবার ভুলে যাবে না তো এর মধ্যে?
না না,
হ্যাঁ, না বলো বলো, আমি শুনছি। হ্যাঁ, না ভুলে যাইনি, বলো।
না, হয়ে গেছে তো আপনার
হ্যাঁ
কথা বলো।
হ্যাঁ
আচ্ছা, আমি যেটা বলতে চাইছিলাম যে এই মাহাররা, তারা কিন্তু সেলিব্রেট করেন ওই ভিক্টরিটাকে ব্রাহ্মণ পেশোয়াদের বিরুদ্ধে ব্রিটিশ ইম্পেরিয়ালিজমের হয়ে যে যুদ্ধ হয়েছিল। মানে সেখানে কাস্ট কোয়েশ্চেনটা অনেক বেশি ইম্পর্ট্যান্ট দেন ব্রিটিশ কলোনিয়াল এক্সপ্লয়টেশন। এবং আজকের জেএনইউতে বহু ছাত্রছাত্রীকে আমি চিনি যারা আম্বেদকারাইট, এবং তারা মনে করেন যে ক্যাপিটালিজম বা নিওলিবারাল হেজিমনিটা, এটা তো এই সেদিন সেদিন জন্ম হয়েছে। তার আগে 4-5 হাজার বছর ধরে কাস্ট অপারেশন চলেছে দলিতের উপরে। অতএব কাস্ট অপারেশনটা অনেক বড়, এবং কোথাও কোথাও নিওলিবারাল হেজিমনি সে কিন্তু এই বিভৎস এই ব্রাহ্মণিকাল হেজিমনির বিরুদ্ধে একটা ইমানসিপেটরি রোল প্লে করেছে। এটা এক। দুই হচ্ছে জেন্ডারের দিক থেকে অনেক ফেমিনিস্ট, অনেক মহিলা বা ফেমিনিস্ট পুরুষের সঙ্গে আমি কথা বলেছি, তাদের কাছে একটা একটা সেকশনের কাছে বক্তব্য হচ্ছে যে ব্রিটিশ আমলের আগে হিন্দু মুসলিম মেয়েরা ভারতে তারা পেট্রিয়ার্কির হাতে বিভৎসভাবে অত্যাচারিত ছিলেন, ডমিনেটেড ছিলেন, এবং সেখানে ব্রিটিশের যে লিবারাল বা কলোনিয়াল বা আজকের দিনে যাকে বলছি নিওলিবারাল হেজিমনি, সেটা কিন্তু কোনো একটা ভাবে ওই নারীকে মুক্তির পথ দেখিয়েছে এবং একটা ইকুয়ালিটি ডিসকোর্সকে এনেছে, যেটাকে অ্যাভেল করছে আজকে LGBTQIA+ মানুষরাও। তাহলে আমি যখন তাদের কাছে গিয়ে ক্যাপিটালিজমের কথা বলছি, তখন তাদের মধ্যে কাস্ট নিয়ে যারা গুরুত্ব দেন, কাস্টকে প্রায়োরিটি দেন, এবং যারা জেন্ডার অপারেশনকে প্রায়োরিটি দেন, তারা মনে করেন যে ক্যাপিটালিজমের বা নিওলিবারালিজম আসার বহু হাজার হাজার বছর আগে থেকে কাস্ট অপারেশন চলছে এবং জেন্ডার অপারেশন চলছে, এবং বরং কোথাও কোথাও নিওলিবারাল হেজিমনিটা একটা ইমানসিপেটরি রোল প্লে করেছে। আমি কি বোঝাতে পারছি আমার কথাটা?
হ্যাঁ,
তাহলে
আমি রেসপন্ড করব।
আমি তাহলে লাক্লাউমুফে যেটাকে বলছেন যে একটা চেইন অফ ইকুইভ্যালেন্স দিয়ে আমি সমাজের বিভিন্ন অংশের ডিফারেন্ট সেগমেন্টস অফ পপুলেশন, মানে থ্রু চেইন অফ ইকুইভ্যালেন্স ইট উইল বি পসিবল টু বিল্ড আপ এ কাউন্টার হেজিমনিক ডিসকোর্স অ্যান্ড এজেন্ডা। হ্যাঁ, সেটা কিভাবে সম্ভব? এটা হচ্ছে 1 নম্বর প্রশ্ন। আর 2 হচ্ছে যে এই যে এতগুলো রকমের ফর্মস অফ এক্সপ্লয়টেশন এন্ড ডমিনেশন রয়েছে সমাজে, আদিবাসী আছেন, দলিত আছেন, তারপরে LGBTQIA+ আছেন, তারপরে চাইল্ড ওয়ার্কাররা আছেন, সেক্স ওয়ার্কাররা আছেন, অবশ্যই প্রলেতারিয়েত আছেন, তার মধ্যে পেজেন্টস আছেন, আনঅর্গানাইজড সেক্টরের ওয়ার্কাররা আছেন, হ্যাঁ, তো ব্ল্যাক পিপল আছেন, আমাদের দেশে নেই কিন্তু অন্যত্র ইউরোপে আছেন, আমেরিকায় আছেন, সাউথ আফ্রিকায় আছেন। তো এই যে বিভিন্ন ফর্মস অফ এক্সপ্লয়টেশন আছে, এই সবকটাকে আমি আহ এইগুলোর মধ্যে আমি কোনটাকে প্রায়োরিটি দেব, কোন কন্ট্রাডিকশনটাকে, সেটা কিসের দ্বারা ঠিক হবে, কে ঠিক করবে? এইটা কিসের ভিত্তিতে ঠিক হবে যে আজকে ক্লাস স্ট্রাগলটাই বড়, এনভায়রনমেন্টের ইকোলজির প্রবলেমটা বড় নয়, আজকে জেন্ডারের প্রবলেমটা বড় নয়, কাস্টের প্রবলেমটা বড় নয়, কিন্তু নিওলিবারাল ক্যাপিটালিজমের প্রবলেমটাই সবচেয়ে প্রধান। এই মানে মাও সেতুং যেমন সেই প্রিন্সিপাল কন্ট্রাডিকশন আর সেকেন্ডারি কন্ট্রাডিকশনের কথা বলেছিলেন, আমি জানি না আপনি সেইটা কেউ আনতে পারেন এর মধ্যে, কিভাবে পুরো ব্যাপারটাকে দেখবো, এই দুটো আমার প্রশ্ন।
আচ্ছা, প্রথমটা যেটা মানে আমি তোমার প্রশ্নের কোনটা উত্তর দিচ্ছি না, আমি জাস্ট ডিসকাশনে এন্টার করছি। হ্যাঁ, কারণ আমার উত্তর আমারও জানা নেই, হ্যাঁ, অনেস্টলি। হ্যাঁ, আচ্ছা, এক হলো যে প্রথম যেটা বলছিলেন না, যে ওইটা যে জয় ভীম জয় মার্কস বলে ওরা, হ্যাঁ, কিন্তু জয় ভীমটাই আগে উচ্চারণ করে। এবং এটাও ঘটনা যে এটা তো সত্যি তো অনেক হাজার বছর আগে থেকে রয়েছে দিস কাইন্ড অফ এক্সপ্লয়টেশন, এবং এটাকে কি করে একত্রিত করা যাবে। এবং আম্বেদকর ওয়াজ অলসো আ ভেরি মডার্ন থিঙ্কার, সেই অর্থে তুমি যে ঠিক যেরকম বলছো আর কি, যে আম্বেদকর ইনফ্যাক্ট হি probably would have been inclined to agree with Marx's view that the British imperialism brought modernity or development to India. Na? So that contradiction remains. As far as gender question is concerned, এইটা কিন্তু এই যে ক্যাপিটালিজম ডাজ অ্যাওয়ে উইথ জেন্ডার এক্সপ্লয়টেশন, এটা বোধহয় এই আরবান এলিট ফেমিনিস্ট এটা বলে আর কি। আমি জাস্ট একটা উদাহরণ দিচ্ছি আর কি। I have been lucky to become familiar with some other forms of patriarchy, যেহেতু আমার কন্যা আর কি একটা রুরাল এরিয়াতে কাজ করে, গো ফ্রম টাইম টু টাইম। সো ওর যে ন্যারেটিভটা সেটাতে বলছে যে আগে, মানে আমারও ধারণা ছিল, যেমন ধরো যে আমার ধারণা যে অনেকেরই থাকে এটা, যে ট্রাইবাল সোসাইটিতে এই জেন্ডার অপারেশন বা ডোমেস্টিক ভায়োলেন্স কম থাকে। হ্যাঁ, তো ওখানে যে যেটা শুনলাম যে না, এটা এক সময় ছিল, মানে এক সময় কম ছিল না, কিন্তু there was an equality, যে স্বামী স্ত্রীকে মারলে স্ত্রীও মেরে দিত। হ্যাঁ, কিন্তু with the penetration of urban culture, হ্যাঁ, the submission of women has become more the norm আর কি। So in that sense আর কি, the spread of capitalism has invigorated patriarchy within at least the tribal community. এবার and patriarchy and capitalism, that they don't go hand in hand, এটা this is a contestable position। মানে যেমন আর কি ধরো যে it is contestable whether capitalism requires a secular democracy. We can very well see so many forms of government which capitalism survives with or even flourishes within. Yeah. So that is there. Now, as regard how do we construct, what do we give prominence to? Environment question, caste question, gender question, class question. Now, you see the question, the answer there is very precise for one who believes in Marxism, that it is a political choice, of course, and as a political choice, the focus is on class exploitation, and therefore we give priority to class exploitation. Now, whether that priority can itself become a hindrance to creating a broad united front, or whether the fact that you're giving priority to the class movement, this antagonizes some oppressed peoples who are organizing their own movement. That is, of course, through the struggle, it will probably emerge. And I think the question is very pertinent, that the local issues are particular and concrete, and in that sense, local movements, I think the question of a global, you see, the state has become so pervasive and exists in so different forms in the different domains, that it is necessary to contest even locally. Of course, I'm just proposing certain positions. I have got no answer to how do we construct a hegemonic position, and whether we can at all construct a hegemonic position. This is just something which is a possibility. If you have to fight, you have to have a democratic, you have to have a front, you have to organize a front. And if you have to organize a front, then you have to then certain slogans must emerge, just as liberty, equality, fraternity emerged. Now, whether that will happen or not, how it will work out, new problems are being created every day, as I was saying, by the gig employees, by the work from home, etc., etc. I really
জীবনীতে সেখানে দাঁড়িয়ে তার কাছে এই কলোনি,
কিন্তু তাতে ওভারঅল পেট্রিয়ার্কি সিগনিফিকেন্স কতটা কমলো, that is something which the sociologists would be able to say. Acha, Pradip, আমার মনে হয় কি অঞ্জন wants to join this conversation.
হ্যাঁ 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 ঠিক আছে,
অঞ্জন, please. Yes, please. অঞ্জন,
কথা শোনা যাচ্ছে পুনর্দা?
হ্যাঁ হ্যাঁ
Okay, I'll not because it's, I think, 1.5 hours, must be tired. So I'll just raise a few points and I'll keep the conversation with you going later on. Just my few observations are that when you were talking, and this pertains to the interior of your lecture, which is, and by the way, I didn't listen to I listened to the first few ones, but not in between. So I might have missed out a few of the things. But one thing is, when you are talking about exchange value and use value, that is the money form, and you are talking about it from a capitalist perspective of capital, and the use value form from the perspective of the worker. And you are kind of introducing the importance of supplement. Supplement comes in actually in that respect. When you're talking about use value, Marx, when he's discussing in Capital from the perspective of labor, I mean, that is in a way internal to capital, isn't it? Because the wage labor is in terms of the socially necessary means of subsistence, which takes the form of basket of goods and services. So which is what the working class is kind of gets, and hence in a way is subjected to. I know you have talked about use value in a broader sense. So I was just wondering that insofar as the interior of capital is concerned, the aspect of use value actually never goes away, because the wage labor, the wage rate is measured in terms of basket of goods and services that they receive. So which is the use value form is use value form is always there actually. So of course I know you have talked about use value not just in case of this but also other aspects. So I was wondering when you are talking about use value from the perspective of laborers, are you talking about laborers under the capitalist class process, or are you talking about laborers in general? This is one issue which I had. I don't know whether I have communicated sufficiently my point actually. কারণ ওয়েজ রেটটা, হ্যাঁ সরি 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 হ্যাঁ, ওয়েজ রেটটা তো তুমি ওই দিয়ে বাস্কেট অফ গুডস অ্যান্ড সার্ভিসেস দিয়েই ওই করছো, তাই না? তো এটা তো ক্যাপিটালের পার্ট, মানে ওয়েজ রেটটা দিচ্ছে এবং মিনস অফ প্রোডাকশন নেই বলে সে সাবজুগেটেডও হয়ে থাকবে ক্যাপিটালের কাছে। তো মানে সে
এইটা মানে আই টোটালি এগ্রি উইথ দ্যাট ইউজ ভ্যালু, মানে মানে অতটা ইলাবোরেট করিনি। ইউ আর রাইট দ্যাট ইট উড হ্যাভ, মানে ট্রান্সফরমেশনের বিষয়ে এগুলো তো আনা ঠিক সম্ভব ছিল না। যে এই দ্য ইউজ ভ্যালু ইন আ সেন্স ইন্টারনাল টু ক্যাপিটাল, মানে when I take that quote from capital from Grundrisse, use value there is in a sense, it can be interpreted in a sense internal to capital, but that can be contested, but true, it can be consistently interpreted in a way internal to capital within the value framework.
Yes, actually, I thought of this because I have read your previous work where you have talked of use value beyond the rule of capital, actually. So the importance.
When I was talking of use value here, you are right also that I was using it in a more general sense. This context, and this of course is something. All these what I am saying are new departures, and just throwing these things. It's not that we can work it out here, but these people need to see that, well, all these can be accommodated in the over. My point, I have two positions. One is that we need to address these issues, and secondly, from a class focused over methodology, which
my second point, Pranab, which is I don't want to discuss it, delay it any further, but just to point out that Perry Anderson was responding to Hindes and Hurst, their modes of production book, which is actually based on structures, on class relations of production, the positions, and they were precisely defining the class in terms of relations of production. And so Perry Anderson launched a critique of them, arguing in terms of class as a historical formation and not structure. This is the context actually of the debate that took place in the 1970s. However, Hindes, just for record, Hindes came back in the 1980s with a book, with a series of papers, and I could later on share with you, and a book called Politics and Class Analysis, where he basically made 3 points. That class as social actors can't exist. Okay, it can't act.